I've heard a lot about the Lunch and Learns in recent years, and it's great to be able to be here with you all today and be here with you in person. I also want to thank, I know a lot of you have actually contributed to the research that we're going to be discussing here today over many years, so it means a lot to be able to share it with you. So I've been coming to Dillingham since 2003, over 20 years, and I'm excited to be able to give you an overview of the book manuscript that I'm aiming to finish in the coming months, which encompasses a good part of the research I've done in Alaska to date. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to read most of my talk just so I can stick to time so we can have a lot of time again for discussion. I should also note at the outset that the book is for an academic publisher, so it's actually pretty long and dense. But given that, I'm committed to making it something that you all feel gratified to have on your shelves. And at the very least, I want to make sure that it carefully and accurately represents the Alaska salmon industry and Bristol Bay in some critical moments of transition. So the book is tentatively titled Unruly Returns, Producing Alaska Wild Salmon in Bristol Bay. As you can see, it's also the title of this talk. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on the title and everything else at the end. I want to use most of my time to give you a sense of the material I cover in the book and some of the arguments I'm making through that, as well as answer any questions you have, and above all, receive your really candid feedback. I'm going to be super grateful for that, and I hope to be able to incorporate this into my ongoing revisions over the coming months. So thank you all for being here. We actually have this room, available for the rest of the afternoon. There's donuts there. There's pizza I see arriving as well. So it would be great, anyone who wants to stick around and talk more. I've also printed out a lot of the materials from the book, draft chapters over there, along with some other of my published articles. So we can also discuss those as well in the afternoon. I should also mention that if you can't stay today, I'm giving a talk tomorrow at the library at 1, or talk or just a discussion more informally. So please feel free to follow up there as well if you'd like. So let me give you an outline of my presentation. I'll first give you an overview of the research I've done that informs this book and discuss how that connects to the main themes before describing the chapters. And then we can move into the Q&A followed by feedback. And if you can't stick around, you can absolutely please stay in touch with me via email. I've listed it here, and there's some cards of mine that are in a couple different spots in the room. So to move into this first part of this research overview, I want to take us all back to the year 2002. When I moved to Alaska, and first to Anchorage, to begin work on the project that grounds this manuscript. And this was my PhD research. Now, as most of you remember all too well, this period in the early 2000s was an extraordinarily dire one for the Alaska salmon industry. And I'd say even more acutely so than the once again really uncertain present. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that at the end. So, by the early 2000s, salmon prices, which had plummeted since the 1990s, were hovering at all-time lows. These were the headlines that greeted you at the supermarket checkout lines in Anchorage when I first arrived in the fall of 2002. As you can see, the cover of Alaska Magazine reads, "Endangered fishermen is our salmon fleet bound for extinction." As this suggests, despite the fact that salmon populations across the state were mostly pretty healthy at this time, there was nevertheless a lot of worry about the industry's ongoing economic viability. Now, this was at some level why I had come to Alaska. At the time, I was a PhD student at the University of Michigan, interested in how resource-dependent communities were being affected by the economic transformations we talked about then as globalization, which in the salmon sector were most visibly tied to the rise in industrial salmon aquaculture globally over the prior decade or two, and especially its rapid expansion in Chile. Now, interestingly, I didn't initially intend to focus my research in Bristol Bay. I'd spent some time earlier in other parts of Alaska, and I was planning to go back there. But as I participated in the many statewide conversations that were being convened at the time, Bristol Bay just kept coming up. These were events, as some of you may recall, may have actually been there, where we saw graphs of plunging salmon prices and photographic evidence like this photo you see here, or two photos actually, of industry overcapitalization, as it is known. And I actually think we saw these actual images in some Anchorage events organized by none other than the Marine Advisory Program. But I actually can't find any photos of these workshops. This is one in Tokyo that's happening around the same time. So if any of you have pictures for around this time to pass my way, I'd welcome those. Now, one of these workshops, I met folks from Bristol Bay who told me that Dillingham would just be the perfect place to do the kind of study I was envisioning. So I feel really lucky to this day that I was able to take their advice. Now, the book manuscript focuses on transformations to the Alaska salmon sector that took shape on the heels of this crisis in the early 2000s. It asks how those involved in the industry, including many of you, responded to these conditions and how those responses shaped work, communities, the trajectory of the industry, and more. Pursuing these questions led me to various phases of research in Bristol Bay and beyond over the past 2 decades. And I wanted to give you just an outline of that, and all of this makes it into the book in some way. Now, here are the main phases of research I've done as I moved through my career, and you'll notice that in addition to lots of return trips, there are these 2 more intensive research periods that I've highlighted. So one that you can see is in the early to mid-2000s and another in the mid-2010s. Now, my earlier research focused pretty squarely on the salmon industry and relied heavily on ethnographic research methods that involve observing, participating, and having conversations in everyday settings over pretty extended time periods. During my research, I did my best to learn about the industry and perspectives on it through stints of work across a range of different fishing operations and other industry settings, like work on a tender and in a fish processing plant. I was also a fixture at innumerable meetings for a few years back in the day. I acted as a regular meeting minute taker for the Michigan Fishing Game Advisory Committee, for example, and I paid close attention to the debates that were happening there and in other similar spaces. So all this represents the core research material contained in the manuscript, in addition to some formal interviews and archival work. Now, the first half of the book is fairly historical, as I'll soon elaborate, and while I rely mostly on secondary sources for that perspective, that's to say others' historical analyses, I do integrate some of my own archival work, as well as some oral histories that I collected in the mid-2010s. Now, this was during a later research phase, centered in the years 2013 to 2015, when I worked alongside a larger research team. You can see pictured here. In guiding this project, I worked closely with a research collaborator and current colleague of mine at Carleton University, Danielle Dinabel-Lang, that you can see in the upper left, who has research experience in Southeast Alaska. We led research teams comprised mostly of graduate students, a lot of them from Yale University, where I was based at the time, to interview residents across coastal Alaska, focusing on Bristol Bay and Sitka, about their experiences of risk. And while this research continued to examine issues involving the salmon industry, it also incorporated attention to the debates underway about the proposed Hébert mine, among other issues. We conducted about 150 interviews across the 2 regions, and this material has made its way into various published articles of mine, which you can see, find listed on my university website, and also you can take a peek at over there if you want in print. And if you ever want to check out anything I published and find it behind a paywall, please just absolutely be in touch. Now, in this project, we made the decision, as I'd done in my earlier research, to keep these interviews confidential and to not use people's real names in any of our written work. So with only a few exceptions, like people in public roles or in archival documents, or speaking publicly on behalf of an organization, or actually publishing work that I then quote, real names do not appear in my book manuscript, and typically pseudonyms are used in their place at times when that might be in order. Now, there are obviously lots of pros and cons to this. And the biggest downside in this team-based project was clearly that so much of the experience and wisdom that was being shared in the interviews were then locked away on a password-protected hard drive. So in addition to the standard interviews, we also did some oral history interviews that were recorded specifically to the public. And this included conversations with a number of people here in Dillingham who graciously agreed to participate. And these interviews are now archived at UAF and publicly available online as part of its Project Jukebox Oral History Program under the title Fishing and Natural Resources in Bristol Bay. And I actually just confirmed this, and it is possible to add to this collection if that's ever of interest to anyone. So while the book's primary focus is on the salmon industry changes that began in the early 2000s, it draws on the research I've done across many years and various phases to situate these transformations within a deeper history and examine their significance into the present. So after such a long preamble, we'll take a quick sip of water. What is this book doing and saying? So on one level, the story it tells is no doubt pretty familiar to all of you because at some level you lived it, right? In broad brushstrokes, the book describes how in the face of industry crisis, participants responded by pursuing efforts to reinvent the industry, as some described it at the time. Most prominently, this included efforts to alter harvesting, processing, and marketing practices to produce fish that could be more successfully sold in the new market spaces that were opening up for wild salmon at the time. And the images on this slide provide just some snapshots of the sorts of activities I'm talking about here, no doubt really familiar to all of you. So we can see here a page from an online quality training program produced by ASNI, a PBEDC tote to promote fish chilling, the cover of a pamphlet from an early branding effort for Bristol Bay wild sustainable salmon, you can see in the words of the center image, and finally a vision of an intended destination. This last photo is of a Whole Foods market that I used to frequent in Michigan, where Bristol Bay salmon could sometimes be found on shelves, typically in packaging that emphasized the product's wildness and sustainability and regional identity, and other compelling stories about Alaska and Bristol Bay fish, intended to connect with consumers in distant locations. Now, the crisis of the early 2000s also spurred fierce debates over many years in regulatory arenas as well. And even if the changes that were introduced there have turned out to be somewhat more circumscribed than at various points in the past it seems like they were really going to be. Still, since the early 2000s, the Bristol Bay fishery has indeed seen the introduction of some significant new regulations, like permit stacking and drift fleet, for instance, as well as ongoing efforts to engage with, buffer, and guide such changes, especially in ways that might address the long-standing concerns about fisheries access in Bristol Bay, given the really well-documented permit dream for rural and Alaska Native Hands specifically, which, as we all know, has not really improved and is in a difficult spot today. So across these different domains, from the fishing season to the breeding season and back again, if you will, we see how the industry's reinvention involves a host of changes that speak to really broader shifts in contemporary capitalism, as well as quite a bit that doesn't change, both for good and for ill. And in terms of what's endured, here I'm thinking about both the persistent inequalities that have been part of the picture since the industry's earliest days, as well as elements that have never been totally under the industry's control in perhaps more positive ways. From the salmon themselves, plenty of other aspects of life in Bristol Bay, such as the interconnectedness of commercial and subsistence economies. Now, by all accounts, the industry reinvention of the past 20 years seems to have restored some measure of stability to the sector, at least for a spell. But the one thing that's quite clear is that it hasn't changed the ongoing periodic pressures for reinvention that rural resource economies seem to demand. Bristol Bay's unruly salmon returns thus provide a view onto economic returns that are also unruly, if in multiple senses, both because they remain subject to the recurring shocks of an ever-changing resource industry and its ongoing hold in the region, as well as because they point to what at times sidesteps these forces, offering a picture of how producers find ways of navigating powerful economic currents to keep in sight more local priorities. So this is the kind of thing I'm playing with in the title of When Marie Returns. We can certainly talk about that one at the end. Now, these ideas help structure the book's two parts. The first three chapters are included in part one, which I'm calling The Wildness of Production, which provides an overview of the industry and analyzes what's changed and what hasn't by tracking issues involving labor, property, and crisis. You can see are these themes featured. These chapters weave together discussions of past and present to examine how the industry's historical development has shaped its more recent shifts, which are then explored more closely in the second half of the book. And this is part two, The Production of Wildness. And here, the book's last three chapters describe efforts to reinvent the industry since the early 2000s, looking at changes to harvesting, marketing, and processing, sort of roughly in that order. So let's dive into these chapters. Now, in addition to some of what I've already mapped out, the book's introduction explains why Bristol Bay is such a useful case. So first, it makes the point that there's quite a bit about the bay and its salmon industry that's pretty unique, right? Even within Alaska and among Pacific salmon fisheries. And of course, this is epitomized by its massive surging salmon returns. It's so extreme, in fact, that we may even wonder how much we can generalize from its experience. Now, I argue that what makes Bristol Bay exceptional is precisely what makes it such an important example. And this is because industries of all sorts reckon in some way or another with elements that elude control, and only more so in resource industries. Second, the Bristol Bay case also shows how a whole series of cookie-cutter concepts and stories often used to analyze economic change aren't totally adequate, because the region and the industry tend to complicate more simplistic accounts. And so, for example, Bristol Bay salmon are wild, obviously, yet they're also produced in a host of ways, co-evolving with humans from time immemorial to this day. Similarly, while the region is almost a textbook picture of what academics have termed a resource frontier, it's also an indigenous homeland and a major industry center and an important economic player, all of which prove consequential for how industry change actually takes shape. Finally, in a more obvious way than many other export industries, salmon has value here locally, right? So Bristol Bay is never only a site of extractivism for distant markets, which itself influences shifts in important ways as well. Now, these points prove relevant, particularly in the book's analysis of industry work. The book starts with a description of the intensity of the fishing season and its distinctive rhythms, and goes on to highlight the heterogeneity and diversity of its workforce, all features that have long characterized the industry. As one observer for the U.S. Fisheries Commission noted at the turn of the 20th century, and quoted, "Labor is needed, particularly when the rush is on, and for which profitable provision cannot otherwise be made," end quote. The book recounts how salmon packers manage this intensive need for peak season labor through a host of pretty brutal strategies intended to make workers more pliable and dependent, which included persistent efforts to divide the fleet along lines of race, ethnicity, national origin, residency, and so on. Now, I realize this is a pretty well-known history to many of you, as is that of the complex labor organizing that arose to confront processor power, as suggested by these archival materials you can see here from local Bristol Bay organizations that were formed specifically to represent resident workers, since residents had long been disadvantaged in unions controlled by outside fishermen. Now, the very existence of these groups speaks to inequalities and exclusions in the fishery that have never been really resolved at some level, I would say. Still, the book makes the case that everyday moments of fishing work have proven to have some potential for at least confronting these industry divisions, since at a minimum, difference in inequality, racism, and cooperation were all sort of actively negotiated in these spaces of teamwork and around-the-clock exertion, as a lot of the stories I heard during my research suggested. Moreover, there was plenty I observed that spoke to relationships with fishing that didn't really always resemble work at all. Now, I can remember seeing a sticker like this in a friend's office years ago here in Dillingham. Work is for people who can't fish, or I sort of remember it being don't fish. But what's interesting to me here is that even though this message may have been intended for recreational fishermen, it gestures to the way that for many in the commercial fishing industry, fishing is far from just labor sold for wages. During the industry crisis of the early 2000s, I lost track of how many times I heard sayings like born to fish, forced to work, or quips like, I used to fish so I didn't have to work, but now I work so I can afford to fish. My analysis of this material across past and present in Bristol Bay shows how industry work both brings people together and divides them, and then at times brings them together again, if often in ways that point beyond work as we typically think about it. So none of this means that fishing work puts everyone in the same boat exactly, and I think all we have to do is sort of take a quick glimpse. You can almost see the boatyard from this window and get a sense that, yeah, there's like huge disparities and inequalities in terms of boats, and I think from what I am hearing, that's only become more extreme in recent years. I think this analysis that I offer in these early chapters does provide a vivid example of how industry control has never been complete, even during the height of like crushing packer power historically, particularly given how the fishery's unruly features have long provided grounds for worker maneuverings. Now, the book further delves into the power of the fleet vis-a-vis processors and thorny questions of equity within and beyond the fleet by tracing changes over the second half of the 20th century that center on property and specifically the extension of rights demarcating territorial control and establishing individual ownership. By looking at these historical shifts alongside more recent debates, such as those involving permit stacking in Bristol Bay, I show how some of the same vehicles that provided power to the fleet have also proved something of a double-edged sword, insofar as this power often comes with some real limitations. Now, if you think about it, as many of you explained to me over the years, from the time in mid-century when the ban on powerboats was lifted and more Bristol-based fishermen started to become independent, to statehood, and especially through the 1970s with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and limited entry, so much changed in Bristol Bay and across Alaska in just a few short decades. There were suddenly many more items and institutions of ownership, more paperwork, more processes like that of the Board of Fish, but at least some of those in the fleet now vested in the fishery and participating there as property stakeholders. Now, I included this history to unpack the debates surrounding fisheries restructuring measures that were heated in the early 2000s and continue in some form into the present. The book highlights the issue of permit stacking in Bristol Bay. I also spent a lot of time talking and thinking about the 32-foot limit. It's sort of not as present in the book as maybe it could be, but that's something that I can happy to talk more about and maybe work in a bit more. The book highlights the issue of permit stacking in particular, though, and describes the bitter divides, even locally, that characterized the discussion when it was proposed and ultimately made it onto the books for the drift fishery in 2003. I try to make sense of why, even though there's certainly still opposition to the measure, it's less fiercely contested today than it once was. I suggest that part of the reason is that it ultimately did not lead to the kind of wholesale sweeping changes of unequal access that were initially feared, or at least it hasn't yet. As many of you well know, various measures to expand permit stacking have been rolled back or defeated over the intervening years, due in large part to involvement of the fleet. And in addition, there's been a lot of effort locally to develop programs that work with and through the existing dual permit structure, such as BBDC loan programs that aim to get young people and region residents into the industry. Now, all of these things strike me as examples of how fishers have come to avail themselves of the relative power that their property position affords. Even if this does little to change the underlying expropriative pressures that accompany individual ownership in fishery, evident most notably in the persistent suck of the permit drain that we've just seen for so long. So I see this as another less positive, unruly return, to use the language of the book, and even threatening to return back to the days when few people locally were involved, fewer than we are at present. So the book makes some related points in its analysis of crisis. Now, some of you might remember this literal collapse of Bristol Bay salmon here in Dillingham in the summer of 2003. So you know it, not Noah smiling, as captured in this photo. I was actually in the warehouse, box and row with other processing workers when the floor caved in. At the time, this collapse seemed like the real-world manifestation of exactly how the industry crisis was being imagined, a sector in ruin, buckling under the weight of an antiquated product. But as my research continued, I heard and saw more that led me to question its initial interpretation. I started to notice more pushback to the idea, especially here in Bristol Bay, that the fate of the region was wholly tethered to the industry, given how this is an Alaska native place where communities long predate the salmon industry, of course. And at the same time, there was also a flurry of local activity directed toward transforming the industry. All this meant that the Bristol Bay salmon sector, much like the Dillingham processing plant pictured here, was not undone in a single shuddering crash. By the end of the summer, the warehouse floor had been rebuilt, and we'd actually recanned and shipped out a lot of the salvageable products you can see here in the foreground. I believe this was sold as number 2s, perhaps not surprising. Now, to me, this parallels the industry's broader reconstruction, which managed to resolve the immediate crisis at the time, but didn't necessarily address the industry's underlying propensity toward crisis and the likely return of some new crisis in the future, as perhaps we've been seeing in more recent years. So, in terms of the activities that emerged on the scene in the early 2000s to support this reconstruction, the second half of the book looks most closely at quality production practices and marketing strategies, which were big topics in Bristol Bay at the time and remain so to this day. These are photos from a processing workshop that took place here in Dillingham in the spring of 2004. Here, residents learned about and discussed the everyday changes that industry experts were recommending, which of course involves the suite of icing, bleeding, and gentle handling and processing practices that have indeed become integrated into the industry, right, in the last 2 decades. Now, the goal here was always to transform fish, as we all know, that might otherwise look something like this, with evident bruising and gaping, into something much more like this image of wild salmon perfection that, of course, we all now know so well. It seems important to note, though, that the technical specifications that inform this picture of wildness were actually established largely by the farm salmon industry as it dramatically expanded the availability of fresh and frozen salmon sold worldwide. So perhaps it's not surprising that the transformation of Bristol Bay fish into this particular image of nature never really happened naturally, as many of you, I'm sure, can remember from firsthand experience. The ethnographic research I recount in the book highlights the everyday difficulties, awkward situations, and confusion that often seem to accompany industry shifts, as harvesters and other workers had to readjust long-standing practices and sensibilities. This includes dilemmas about how much to focus on quality handling during the peak of the fishing season, ongoing pressures for volume, always palpable at the tender when you're looking at how many bags everyone else is delivering, as well as an awareness that surfaced repeatedly throughout my research that the qualities of salmon that are most prized locally may not play exactly the same in Peoria or wherever these end consumers might be located. So all this suggests that the industry transformation that's taken place here was far from easy or inevitable, even as these changes were, I think, largely welcomed. A lot had to happen to make possible a shift from the industry's long-time orientation celebrating volume and top boats and highliners like we see here. Obviously, this hasn't totally gone away, right? But there's been a shift to an emergent ideal that to this day tends to present salmon as more special and singular, even if, you know, the fishing fleet is still paid for by the pound. Now, the book ultimately emphasizes how the making and marketing of salmon is wild. It rather ironically demands ever more meticulous work, and in fact, work that's often geared toward making its own transformative action visible, generating fish that seem to have leapt straight from the sea onto a dinner plate, if you will. This work includes not just quality handling practices, but various kinds of monitoring, auditing, and record keeping as well. And it also expands industry labor into other new domains, as producers are often called to more actively put themselves in the shoes of consumers and even to craft narratives, positioning themselves in terms that they imagine will resonate with others on the far end of commodity chains. Now, this was all starting to happen during my research, but I think it's become only more strikingly apparent today. So take, for example, this Our Story section that can be found now, it seems to me, like pretty much on almost every website featuring Alaska salmon. This particular Our Story is from a consumer-facing website run by the BBRSDA, but in general, this seems to me to almost be a mandatory part of salmon marketing at present. I want to suggest that all of this not only intensifies the work of salmon production, but also alters the nature of this work, as novel modes of knowledge and imagination become more actively enlisted in exchange. When we think about natural resource industries, we tend to think about the extraction of raw materials from the earth. We're not usually thinking about knowledge economies. But the transformation of Alaska's salmon suggests that a whole range of elements are now being harnessed as resources as well, including producers' identities and their relationships to their catch and evidence of sustainability, which are then remolded for distant markets with and much like the fish themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that these changes are necessarily bad for producers in practical terms. I was really struck during my research by the positive way that people typically spoke about these efforts, even those who say confronted challenges that led them to really tough decisions to continue work on promising new salmon business ventures, for instance. At the same time, these conversations highlighted that in the production realm, as in fisheries policy, there are some enduring structural impediments that continue to constrain what's possible, whether the issue involves the establishment of community processing facilities or securing community fishing rights. Now, in spite of these barriers and really structural challenges in a deep way, the story of Bristol Bay salmon is still, by most measures, a positive one. Even in the face of recurring crises, underlying challenges, ongoing inequities, and emergent uncertainties, like, for example, the implications of climate change. And I think the positives are more palpable when we consider the state of seafood industries globally. In recent years, I've connected as part of an informal research network with some scholars who study sites in industrial salmon aquaculture in eastern Canada and southern Chile. And I even had a chance a few years back to visit production sites in Chile. And all of this, drove home anew for me what everyone here already knows how significant it is that the Alaska salmon industry is an ecologically sound sector steered to a significant degree by small-scale owner-operators. Now, obviously, this can and should qualify in countless ways. There are people in the industry and quite possibly in this room who participate in fishing but are not included among the permit holders who make up the particular hour that we see referenced in Our Story picture here, for example, right? But to the extent that the industry continues to serve as this region's economic engine, but also its social net, as one region resident I spoke with years ago put it, fittingly using boat metaphors to describe this. This is undoubtedly due to the ceaseless efforts of so many of you, year after year, across so many fishing seasons and eating seasons, not only to reinvent the fishery, but also to continue to advocate on its behalf and that of Bristol Bay. So, where does this leave us? I don't offer a neat set of policy recommendations or directives at the end of this manuscript. It's not exactly that kind of book, and the truth is, I'm actually still writing the conclusion. I also want to leave time for discussion, especially since maybe you will have some ideas for the conclusion of me. Perhaps, in fact, we can talk about where you think the fishery will be in the next 20 years, your sort of hopes and fears, how you think it's going to get there, or how you'd like to see for that to happen. But I will say that I hope my story, the one I aim to finish in the coming months, the story of industry change and unwilling returns and the production of wildness that I offer in the book, can be enlisted to inform the ongoing work that, for better or for worse, I think no doubt lies ahead for all of you, and that I feel really privileged to be able to follow for so long. So with that, I will open the floor to your questions, and then also definitely I'd love for the time remaining to hear your feedback. Any question already? Thank you.
Yes. I really hope that in your conclusions you will be providing recommendations on how to deal with the problems that you have, and the history that you articulated really well. I mean, excellent.
Thank you. Can everyone, do you want it, Fritz, do you want this mic? I feel like
No, not really, but this is the kind of thing that definitely sparks continuing conversation with many of us who are trying to overcome the issues that we described.
yeah,
When you take into consideration that our percentage of the world's salmon production is extremely small compared to the wild salmon or farm salmon production is like 2.5 million tons a year, and we produce maybe 130,000.
yeah,
We're a very small part, but
right,
in a way that puts us in a position of offering a let's say not so much a commodity but a specialty product.
right,
And that would seem to several of us to be the challenge. And how to make a living in addition to protecting local access to the fishery within Alaska's coastal communities, which is certainly Ben falls there.
exactly, exactly.
Can you mind rephrasing it or repeating it for people online?
Oh, okay, so Fritz just offered a really eloquent question that describes the real challenges that exist in the fishery, given the fact that it's a small player in terms of salmon production worldwide, given the output of aquaculture, but given its significance in maybe a smaller market for wild sockeye salmon in particular, but how to balance economic pressures also with the importance of maintaining sort of local participation in the industry and ownership in the industry in a more significant way. And he was asking me why I don't offer recommendations on this. So many of us are really struggling to think through this. And I mean, the conclusion's not written yet, so maybe, but I think there are a lot of people who have more awareness of the policy landscape and implications who are working on these issues, and I definitely tend to be in close conversation with them, including all of you, to think through some of the practical implications about this sort of larger arc that I'm showing. I mean, I do think I do think it's what was interesting to me even in preparing this talk is that you have many different sites of industry engagement, whether it's in the processing side or in terms of fishing permits. You have people who want to do things collectively involving participation, but there are so many blocks to that, given how these property relations are structuring that. So I do think it sounds like there are discussions afoot and maybe some creative new ways that these that individually sort of owned and transferable things that really limits that really limits some of this stuff. That's clear. But again, I think there are so many people in this room I know who are really engaged in those conversations in a much closer way, and I would definitely defer to them. But thank you.
It was kind of an unfair question.
It's all my problem. I actually remember when I first came up here, I was introduced by someone that was like, this is Karen, she's a researcher, she's gonna tell us how to fix our salmon industry. And I was like, oh, that's just early in my graduate school days, I feel like that's a lot of pressure, but yeah, so needless to say, it's not gonna be me alone, but I am obviously interested in talking more about all this and being a part of the the large set of people it's gonna take to imagine things differently. Yeah, so, yeah. Do you hear?
Reverend Mike, no, I don't need it. I'm just curious because, you know, you did a lot of interviews. Did any of your interviews include folks from the Chicknick subregion on the Pacific side?
So no, I did in the very early days of my research before I'd actually moved out to Dillingham. I did attend a lot of those early board of Fed discussions of the Chicknick co-op. So I was certainly following that quite closely when I was here, but no. Even in the project that I did that involved a lot of grad students, we did some interviews on the side of Bristol Bay, but it was more heavily focused here, and we never got over to the Chicknick area. So, thanks. Yeah, Jerry.
You and I had talked briefly about any kind of discussion would be really interesting coming out of this presentation. It would be for people to imagine in their mind, what will this fishery look like 25 years from now? We started with your piece here back in about 2000, 25 years past. And if we would have sat here at the beginning of 2000 saying, what would this place look like, the salmon fishery look like in 2025? I think for the most part, people would have been way off on what it looks like in terms of the composition of the fleet. I think in 2000, there may have been 5 Russian boats, even 5. Now there's probably more Russian boats than local boats. Nobody would have guessed. In terms of technology, the Tim Sanses of the world have got to work with. I don't think we would have guessed what they are now. Norm Van Vacker did a very interesting talk a couple of weeks ago, on drones and how drones may affect this. So it'd be interesting to just, for people to think about, brainstorm, and what is this place gonna look like in 2050? Are there gonna be any local fishermen left? What's the laws gonna be? Are they gonna have 45 footers, 60-foot limit boats? That's a possibility. What kind of technology is coming out now that will help manage and increase this fishery? What kind of economics? Is there going to be one buyer out there, or are we still going to have 5 or 10? In 2000, there were probably 30 buyers in Bristol Bay. Now there's probably a dozen at the most. So anyway, the imagine of what it looks like in the next 25 years would be a pretty interesting discussion for everybody to brainstorm.
I'd love to hear that brainstorm discussion if anyone feels like jumping in.
Just one thought, I think there's gonna continue to be tension between the people who really live here versus the distant water fleets that's been exploiting this resource for as long as it's been in existence, and it's likely to lead to increasing pressure for instance, bigger boats and bigger shares of the pie, permit setting. I remember in the 2000s and what was identified as the crisis in those years, a couple of years, several years were declared economic disasters, and the industry itself was very much like it is today. But I do remember a comment from Norm Van Vacker when he was with. Was Norman working at BBC in 2002, or was he still?
No.
Peter Pan.
Oh, he's still Peter Pan. But he said at the time that trying to find ways to harvest these fish more efficiently, there was nothing in CFEC regulations that would have prevented seiners from coming into the bay that very summer. Well, that didn't happen, but, there'll be continue to be economic pressure to consolidate this industry in ways that doesn't necessarily, help human beings. You could probably harvest the whole Bristol Bay pack with a handful of super seiners and leave people out of it entirely. I think personally that would be tragic. So anyway, that's all we're gonna have right now, but those pressures will continue.
No, absolutely, I mean, I'm not more of an expert than anyone in this room, but it seems clear looking at this historically and talking to all of you, that it does seem like there's not an end to those pressures anytime in the foreseeable future.
We may have a bold decision here.
Yeah, here.
Give half the fish to locals.
I now feel like I've been like and talking around, looking for other people who want to weigh in on this question of where the fishery will be in 20 years. And
I got my limited entry permit in '73 when the state was handing them out. And fished every year except for last year. I turned the boat over to my grandsons, and the permits are my grandsons. Fishing's been very, very good to me and my family. I was a big supporter of limited entry when it happened. We had no fish in the bay. We had more and more folks coming up, state of Washington, Oregon, California, looking to take their millions out of Bristol Bay. Along comes the limited entry program, and it was gonna favor the local residents, which it did. The bulk of set net permits and drift permits were given to local residents. However, over time, I've watched the sale of both set net and drift permits really hurt Bristol Bay. It helps a person living in a village has two things to sell: a set net drift permit or native allotment. And when families get in trouble, financial trouble, they look to sell either one of them, and they want to sell fast. Today, I think we have about 635 permits left in the fishery, both set net and drift. When my great-great-grandfather, John W. Clark, started the fishery over in Michigan and invested his money in the first cannery up at Carmel, there was quite a few Russians fishing then, and they all left. And then the Italians came in, and the locals were not given fishing jobs. Very few locals were able to fish for the canneries. And very few locals were able to work at the canneries. It was Chinamen that they brought up from San Francisco, Seattle, into the bay, and then there was Filipinos. The only time the canneries looked at locals to fish and to work in the canneries was during World War II, when all the white boys from Lower 48 went off and fought World War II. They didn't have enough fishermen to harvest the catch. And they started employing a local fisherman, both set net and drift, and employing people in their canneries. So, as we sit today, I look at the fishery. Limited entry has failed us badly in Bristol Bay. For every dollar a fisherman brings into a community, brings into Equok, that dollar transfers to $1.50. I remember when I used to Buck River, still do, in Hanboos, the beach in front of New Stuyok was lined with Ron Ross's. You don't see that anymore. Where are all them permits? A lot of them have been sold. 20 years from now, there's gonna be, I think, a hell of a lot less fishermen in this fishery. As the average age is about 53 years old now, where residents holding a permit. maybe 55, it's either 53 or 55. There's gonna be more people that are gonna be selling their permits and moving into, Palmer and Wasilla to Anchorage, because of the high price of electricity, because of the high price of fuel, because of the high price of groceries. Everybody's gonna be, on a fixed income. In a village today, you don't have the vibrant economy that you did back in the 70s and early 80s. I noticed when I go to villages, I noticed it here in my own village, Dillingham. So I think we need to look at limited entry. And I completely oppose limited entry as it now stands. Every time an agency tries to help a local resident, there's a way to sell that help and put more George Washingtons in your pocket. And we've had people lined up to spend their George Washingtons on Bristol Bay sediment and drift permits. And I think today we need to do something to reverse the course that is happening. BBDC is helping a number of residents, I think there's about 60 permits since we started the program, of putting permits into residents' hands. That's just a drop in a bucket. When we started that program, there was no Russian fishermen in Dillingham, and anybody that's been on shore on a Saturday or a Sunday, look at that harbor. There's only one style of boat down there, and it's a Russian boat. All the slips are taken, and half of the harbor is full. That's not only indicative of Bristol Bay. I recently came from a meeting last week in Anchorage. I went a year ago, and I went again last week to look at the fisheries and permits situation in the community of Alaska. Not Bristol Bay, Southeast, Prince William Sound. There's communities in Southeast Alaska down to 2 permits left in that village. 2 permits, where they had 30 before, where they had 45 before. It's a different fishery than ours. But the state needs to take a look at the fishery. We need to take a look at the fishery, because what is in place today is not working for the region residents. And to put the demand on young people like my grandsons to get into this fishery, if I didn't subsidize them, they'd never get into the fishery, because the cost of insurance is upwards of $10,000. Your nets are triple the cost they were 4 or 5 years ago. Your price of fuel is at the highest it's ever been. And it's damn near financially advisable to stay out of the fishery as a young person, because your chances of success are so slim. When I entered the fishery, I was given a permit. And in my early years of fishing, when I was a teenager, I've got statements from the income tax that I filed. I made $325 a year. And I was happy at the time as a young juvenile punk to make that kind of money. Today, you can't even fill up a quarter of your fuel tank for that price. And I see a lot of problems within the fishery that is happening. Every one of the regulations that we are adopting is trying to make the highliners better highliners. And the people that are that have the smaller boats that can't afford to stack a permit are the ones that are suffering. And that's the people that I work for. That's the people that I represent. And I've had enough of white men coming into this region and capitalizing on the resources and taking it all home. At that meeting last week, I was in Anchorage, $5.2 million was harvested in Alaska in fisheries like Bristol Bay. Only 1.2 of that billion stayed in the state. And you could look at the graph and it's going like this, not only here, but all over Alaska. So, you know, Cheshbuck said we need a boat decision. Hell no, we need an Annie decision. An Annie decision, because we don't have the tribal, I also served as a 30-year tribal chief of the Tribune Tribal Council. We don't have, our governor just barely recognizes the tribes in Alaska. But I've come to the conclusion, since I turned everything over to the my grandsons, that this is not gonna work for Bristol Bay in the future. And I'm moving forward to take the state on, whether it's in court or not, or in the legislature, and make it an issue and bring it to light. From what I've learned, not only in Bristol Bay, but all the communities that have relied on fisheries, the state has failed us miserably.
Thank you, Robin, that's so important, and I'm glad everyone got to hear it. I don't know if we need to stop or there's time for. Well, obviously, this is what I love to do, this is why I spent 20 years coming back here. But, does anyone wanna add, to the conversation right now? We can obviously stay and talk after, but there's some folks still online. Anyone else?
Thank you, Karen. Good to see you. I echo your comments, Robin. Yeah, the other thing that I think is missing in this equation is we all focus on the finances of this issue and the health of our socket. The underneath all of that, if you look at the other areas like Yukon, Keswick, and North and South, speaking from a cultural perspective, it's not always money. In our region, it's our ability to subsist and live in harmony, right? That's what we all look for and what we live for. It's a situation that's kind of growing. I mean, the sockeye salmon fishery is wonderful. For some reason, that fish is thriving in Bristol Bay for us. Unfortunately, the king salmon and the chums are suffering, and we're still trying to figure out what's going on. So, you know, I think we need to make sure that we have a holistic view of what's happening. You know, I know we celebrate the sockeye very well. We're damn lucky to have them. But also what we need to make sure is, you know, the other species that are here, barely here. So that's a thought.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you raised that because that does seem like something that's come to the fore recently. And it's one of these things also that seems like whatever is explaining that, like it's not going away anytime soon. It doesn't seem like in terms of the underlying conditions. Other comments to add to the discussion? Thoughts?
I really appreciate in your work how you've called out that this economy and this resource is very affected by what are, you know, at times uncoordinated or even disparate factors that, you know, just like your title states, can be very unruly. But it seems too like you've also highlighted a few unifying threads that track throughout. Yeah, I look forward to reading your work as it continues, and would like to see maybe more clearly identifying those threads in the conclusion. But I think if we're trying to like, you know, postulate what this resource is going to look like 25 years from now, I think, you know, clearly identifying what are the things that we can really pull out of all of these very seemingly uncoordinated sets of data or trends. Because I think, you know, trying to characterize those and follow how those trend out moving forward would be, you know, the way that we could really kind of try to make sound decisions moving forward. And I kind of think echoing what P was saying, that, you know, a holistic view of this, not just from the financial standpoint, but also from the cultural standpoint, also from the subsistence standpoint. What does this look like, say, as far as, you know, the integration of technology and supply chains and the economics of, you know, how we fish. So yeah, I look forward to reading your work there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it is, I don't wanna overplay the unruly part too, because it's like what underpins that is a lot of stuff that's like these logics and that we're the labor property crisis part. I mean, there's a lot, we you know, there's a lot about how those things work that's sort of baked into what this, and we see that happening, you know, when you make things freely transferable to marketize them, it's like, that's what happens, they get sold, you know? So I definitely wanna emphasize that it's not arbitrary, those things, even if it doesn't always work out exactly the way you think it's going to. There are certainly some strong underlying currents, and I appreciate that reminder for me and everyone else. Thanks. Any last thoughts, comments? Yeah. I'm so it's not a problem to me.
I have one comment on Brits in the marketing and the amount of product we put up. You know, right now Russia is trying to cut our markets in Europe. They're trying to steal every market we have in Europe. Putin's in a massive shipbuilding mode. They had the Japanese go up there, show them how to farm fish, raise hatchery fish, and they're dumping truckloads of salmon in the tundra. I've seen videos of them going out the tundra, big dump trucks, and dumping salmon because they don't have the processing facilities in Russia in place. But they've got big returns like we got here, and they're eyeballing of stealing our markets, and they're using the, you know, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have computers like we do today. And they're putting a propaganda on to Europe that trying to steal our markets, and that's a major threat to Bristol Bay, the Alaska economy.
My understanding is that has played a role in prices in recent years, so that's correct. So much more to discuss, I'm sure. I don't know if there are any more comments immediately now before we close. Anyone? Yeah.
If anybody needs a greenhorn next to you, give me a.
You gotta give them your name and your, you know, social contacts, yeah.
Here, Todd, I don't know if you wanna shut things down or.
Sure, yeah, thank you all for coming. I appreciate all the involvement, questions and comments and everything, and Karen's gonna be here today to have this space, so if you wanna come in and chat more, and she'll also be there tomorrow, so if this starts getting the gears working, or you think of people that you wanna invite tomorrow or later today, please do. It's a pretty important conversation to have.
Thank you so much, Tab.